One of the most adored performers in the world, Keanu Reeves, is renowned for his quiet power and humility, but at A, he discloses something unexpected in a unique interview about voices that inspire the globe. There was a man who saved me, but I was never able to express my gratitude. He mentions a high school instructor. Someone saw him before he saw himself, someone who stood by him when no one else did, but Keanu is unaware of. That the man in question is seated in the studio in the final row. Listening what follows is an intensely moving experience of thankfulness and remembrance, and a secret that has been held for decades. Before we get started, where are you watching from? We read every remark and enjoy hearing from you. The studio was filled with expectancy as the audience sat in silence. The lighting had been somewhat lowered, giving the impression that it was more like a peaceful living room than a television set. The host looked towards the door and shuffled some papers on his desk. Later, the door opened gently, and Keanu Reeves entered wearing his typical composed gait while wearing only dark trousers, modest blazer and a simple black t-shirt, his hair a little untidy, and a thin beard. That look that never fails to look past the camera. The crowd gave him a cordial but respectful round of cheers, as though welcoming someone who wasn't just from Hollywood but also. In reality, he waved a little, smiled shyly, and sat down on the couch. Set aside for him, the host, a man with a deep voice and contemplative eyes, started the light-hearted interview. Keanu, first of all, I want to thank you for coming. You are unquestionably one of the voices that motivate people worldwide. How does carrying that feel? I don't think much, Keanu said with a smile that showed his humility. I simply try to keep going forward, one step at a time, without thinking too much about it. The first questions were standard behind-the-scenes movie anecdotes about humorous sequences from The Matrix. Keanu responded with his customary modesty, on set his relationships with co-stars, frequently shifting credit to others, but as the minutes went by, the mood gradually changed. The host closed one of his folders and leaned forward, making eye contact with Keanu. Today, we also want to discuss something a little unusual about the individuals that influenced you and made a difference before you became famous. Keanu blinked. His eyes dropped to the ground as his shoulders gradually slumped forward. The whole studio went silent, and then there was a prolonged wait, the kind of silence that time seems to stop for someone when Keanu finally speaks. My high school teacher, a man I haven't seen in decades, is quieter and more profound. The host kept quiet to allow Keanu to speak. He didn't merely instruct me. He showed me how to endure when I felt like giving up. The audience held its breath as Keanu gazed at the floor, then upward as though looking for a memory held in a different place on the ceiling. I recall something he stated to me once, when I was feeling like I wanted to vanish. He took the words, which reverberated around the studio like a holy chant. You don't have to be perfect to be important. Someone. Keanu paused for a moment as the audience sobbed quietly, which rescued me. The host swallowed hard, and then added his voice, which is now hardly audible, but I never had a chance to thank him. Nothing else could be spoken because the story had already taken up the room. Then he inquired a seemingly innocuous but subtly significant question. Do you recall this teacher? Keanu's personality? Tall, slender, and usually carrying books under his arm, his face softened with tenderness. He paused, and I was perplexed. He laughed quietly, and this kept you sane even when everyone else ignored you. Teenager, my sister was becoming ill, my father had vanished, and I felt foolish and useless. Dyslexia, the other children made fun of me, but he handed me the main part in a school play. He had faith in me when I had no idea what that meant. The host nodded, as if he had noticed something. Keanu replied with a small nod, looking at me as though he saw it in me before you could see it in yourself. The crowd was clearly touched when they saw a warrior before the armor was even constructed. The host paused for a bit, and some people wiped away their tears while others gripped their hands in their laps. He took a piece of paper off his desk and gave it a quick glance. Keanu, before we Proceed, there's something you should know. Keanu gave him a curious and vulnerable look. The host turned, quietly addressing the audience. Keanu is unaware that this instructor is. He is about to do something that the entire world will never forget as he is seated in the back row of the studio today. Soft. For a minute, lights illuminated the back row, and a silhouette seemed still. Uncertain, Keanu turned where the host had pointed, and his eyes grew wide. The studio was utterly quiet, as though his soul had sensed something his head hadn't fully understood yet. The preceding moment's quiet was still heavy and breathless, and Keanu's gaze remained fixed on the hazy figure in the studio's last row. No name, no confirmation, just a force that tugged at a deep-seated memory. The host chose not to move forward quite yet, giving Keanu time to collect himself and breathe. Could you please, Keanu, transport us back to the period before the roles before the... Keanu's fingers folded and his gaze flicked down. But who are the cameras? I was a really damaged child, so he took a moment to find the ideal pieces of himself in the past, but my mom was doing her hardest and my dad was gone. We relocated frequently, and my sister became ill. At first, we weren't sure what it was, but the hospital stay began to arrive more often, and I was merely attempting to blend in. The audience was hushed, captivated by my dyslexic reading difficulties. The words on the page bounced instead of remaining still. Teachers didn't know what to do after I failed classes and was taunted by dancers. Some gave up, but the majority simply ignored me. He looked up, his eyes heavy with age. With one exception, the host acknowledged the shift by nodding. Tell us about him, Keanu took a. He taught literature, but that wasn't exactly what I learned from him. Offered me insight into his patience and presence. Spoke softly, as if he were saying that I wasn't broken but hadn't yet unfolded. He spoke things that lingered in my bones. One day when I was sitting by myself after he had taken them out of the bottom of a closed drawer. I was embarrassed in class because I stumbled when reading aloud, and everyone laughed. Approached and quietly sat down next to me before saying, Keanu's voice dropped. Several individuals whisper that you don't need to be flawless to be significant. The MC remained silent, allowing the audience to wipe away their tears. Finally, I felt valued for the first time, not because I was skilled at stuff, but the host ultimately changed everything because I was there. Keanu nodded when I asked, was that when you started acting? He put me in a. I could hardly talk in front of people without shaking the others, so it made no sense for school to play the primary role. He chuckled, but he added, this part is about presence, not performance. You have that, too. He shook his head, almost incredulous, believing in something I couldn't even describe. The host cocked his head in contemplation, asking, what do you think he did? That? Keanu gazed off into space, lost in concentration. I believe he was aware of it. What was it like to be invisible? Perhaps he recognized something. He hesitated, then decided to reach in. The host leaned forward a little rather than turning away. What if I told you that during... Keanu blinked. Her teacher was dealing with a personal tragedy that same year. What do you do? You mean he had suffered a profound loss of a loved one? Something that might have. Keanu sat back in shock as he revealed his heart to you after having previously closed it. Discovery came as a shock. I was unaware of it. The host nodded, since genuine mentors don't always display their wounds, they just ensure that you live. Keanu's voice was now raspy, which increases the potency of whatever he did. He wasn't simply... There was a long pause in the studio as he was teaching, and then the presenter added, the people who come to our aid are sometimes secretly bleeding themselves. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment. He transformed my life, and I never once told him. As he held something back, the host glanced down at the page. Keanu looked up, perplexed. You might have a chance to say it now. Are you saying that the host turned slowly in the direction of? The back row is being scanned by the audience. Some folks only enter our lives once. once, while for others, they wait in silence till the time is appropriate. Seen once again, the camera delicately panned to the audience's last row. An older man's silhouette is seen sitting with his hands folded, no names are given. Keanu didn't say anything, simply followed the stare and confirmed. Something in his gaze altered, and his shoulders stiffened as he caught his breath. That moment marked the end of the chapter. Recognition, skepticism, and optimism were unclear. The student's recollection of the enigma in the shadows and the weight of an unspoken word dangling between them, sometimes the loudest. As Keanu reclined back on the studio couch, his gaze still fixed on the back row, he sensed that a room sound was a memory, where a man's shadow might have remained motionless, with no words. Shows only a silent, vigilant presence, the host recognizing the emotional vulnerability. Change the topic of discussion with care. Keanu, as you've frequently been characterized as a quiet spiritual person who has always belonging to your identity. Keanu didn't respond right away. Instead, he gazed. I don't know if I'd describe it as spiritual, but I've always listened for him to fidget down with the edge of his sleeve. What was left unsaid even as a child, I felt more at ease in quiet than in. The crowd was still waiting for every word. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than words. Keanu added the teacher, whom he knew, before any statement. The host leaned. Was there a particular instance that stuck with you when you were gently directing the thread? Keanu nodded gradually, and his eyes grew softer as if he were watching an old movie play in his head. Yes, my sister had this chick. She had just returned from the hospital, and I was afraid, but I tried not to show it at school because I was having trouble focusing. I was so furious that I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't even realize I was staying behind when everyone else went at the end of class. A tiny, sentimental smile pulled at his lips till the room was empty. Approached my desk without asking me to talk or what was wrong. He simply gave me an envelope, nodded, and left without saying anything. Softly, the host inquired, "What's inside?" Keanu delved into the inside pocket of. He carefully took out a small piece of folded, old paper from his blazer. He held this up carefully, forming it into a tight square. He wrote Keanu a brief letter, and the audience leaned forward as though they were viewing a treasure they had preserved for years. His voice was barely above a whisper when he cleared his throat and read it out loud. Even stillness has a sound. Keanu, you are not lost. Pay attention to your soul before the world drowns it away. You're getting used to hearing a panting silence descended across the studio as Keanu pressed. When my sister was on the verge of passing away, the line from the letter to his chest carried me. When I wanted to give up and couldn't act, it reminded me that silence implies sacred, not empty. The host's blinking was clearly moved. Keanu nodded, nestled inside a Bible that I've had with me since I was 17 years old. And you kept it all these time. Changed places, occupations, and relationships, but this letter accompanied me everywhere. He stopped, then stated. Occasionally, I didn't believe in myself, but I had faith in the youngster to whom he addressed this. That was plenty to continue. The audience remained motionless, with only the sound of hearts and no coughing or movement. Keanu, we received something earlier, the host stated, looking down almost grudgingly. We weren't first certain what it signified, but now I believe you'll want to see. He handed Keanu the envelope he had grabbed from on his table. It appeared. The most remarkable aspect was the original cream color, which was a little frayed at the corners. Keanu glanced at the handwriting and froze. The camera slightly zoomed in, observing the way his eyes opened as he touched the handwriting, not out of surprise but with a profound sense of recognition. This is the same voice that broke the paper with 2 fingers. He folded it, even the ink, and it looked exactly like the one I had saved. He gazed at the envelope for a while, then gradually opened it to reveal one sheet of paper with the same fine calligraphy, but your quiet was more powerful than. Keanu blinked back his tears, but I heard all you said. Gazed directly up at the audience's rear row. The silhouette had not changed, not a word, not a wave, but something had changed, perhaps in Keanu, perhaps in the air. The host covered his heart with both hands. We don't always know who is listening, but occasionally the ones. Keanu's hands quivered as the person who taught us how to hear never stopped listening, whispering as he folded the paper, and if I could speak to him today, I would say, thank you for seeing me, for teaching me that silence doesn't mean silence, and for listening to what I couldn't speak mean I'm alone myself. His eyes were still fixed on the studio's single seat, dropped into reverent silence once more. There was no movement, no music, just silence. The unspoken but completely understood message was hidden in that hush. The studio had assumed a new shape, the gap between worlds, not the wait before speaking. Between a boy and the man he had grown into, between the past and the present, between A. Keanu sat with the second letter sitting between the teacher and the pupil he had previously saved. Since reading those last lines, he had kept it in his hands. I've heard every word you never said, the host said. Waited for a long pause before speaking. Keanu, if that teacher, what would you like to tell him, Keanu, if he could hear you now that you're here today? His eyes trembled, but his voice remained calm, so I would tell him that he did more than assist me pass a class. He kept me alive and gave me hope that I had something inside of me worth battling for. A silence fell over the crowd. Film, I've said every word I've ever said, and each time I entered a room where Keanu gulped and told me that I felt out of place because I carried his voice with me. Being here was sufficient. I didn't need to be flawless, and occasionally, when all else failed, that was what kept me going. The host turned to face the back of the studio and spoke softly. Would you inform him that Keanu has now followed the look, his gaze going back to the same shadowed person in the last row? He remained silent for a while, so if he could hear me today, I would remark, you rescued me. Without ever expressing gratitude, you quietly provided me something that no one else ever. The studio was completely quiet, and then the host spoke. Did his voice crack? Well composed, facing the audience. Life might be difficult at times. Holding a thank you that has been unsaid for decades because we never get to speak it. Debt that is assessed in identity rather than favors. He stopped before continuing. Said more slowly, and occasionally we're fortunate enough to say it before it's too late. As the camera expanded to reach the back row, there was a faint, nearly undetectable change in the lighting. The silhouette was still seated, but this time there was a little more visibility. A white-haired man's profile with his hands clasped and shoulders arched forward slightly as though supporting a silent weight. Watching with his eyes still hidden while reclining on his lap. The host returned to the unidentified but unquestionably present. Keanu, what would you like him to see if you could gaze into his eyes right now? Keanu didn't blink, knowing that he was important and that every silence. His hands folded, and the minute he spent believing in a lost child sent away farther than he could ever imagine. Slowly and reverently read the letter once more. He was the first person to make me feel. I saw another pause, and I will always remember him. The audience turned as the camera briefly shifted to the back row once more. Additionally, there is a gentle rustle of bodies, heads, and eyes moving and looking for. The presence was unquestionable, even if the figure didn't flinch or speak. The host closed his folder and asked Keanu one last question. He glanced at the actor, right in the eyes. What would you do if that teacher had stepped up right now? Keanu's response was prompt. I would approach him, give him a hug, and I would say all of my positive traits, all of my kind words, all of my hands. I've hung on to every instance where I've assisted someone else in beginning what you gave me, he said in a quiet but clear voice, and I hope he understands that. The individual in the back row makes a slight, intentional movement. Keanu saw it and briefly stopped breathing as someone softly placed one hand on the armrest. No one said anything. Keanu, the presenter, and the crowd, because sometimes presence speaks louder than words, More than names, and the truth, the complete, impossible, lovely truth, was going to. The studio had ceased to move, and the man in the final row, the one Keanu had discussed with respect and desire, was now standing slowly, purposefully, and Keanu rose up as well. They gazed at one another from a distance as though time had stopped, and the teacher walked down the aisle, and the years revealed that this was the only moment left. Keanu moved forward from the stage, meeting him halfway, yet there was meaning in each stride. One spoke, followed by a long, silent, and intense embrace before they parted ways. Keanu's eyes were glassy, and although the teacher's hands shook a little, the host finally intervened, her stare unwavering. "Sir, may we ask your name?" The man, Charles Whitmore, grinned softly and spoke in a steady, weary voice, but to one young man. "I was just Mr. Whitmore when Keanu exhaled a breath that seemed to last for decades." Mr. Whitmore then turned to Keanu. "You were more than just a pupil. You served as a reminder to me that even in times of sorrow, there's a reason to continue in silence." The audience listened in silence. I didn't think I could continue teaching after losing my wife that year. Everything in me wanted to stop, but then you entered my class feeling a little hurt but filled with something nobody else noticed. Keanu, I was shocked to learn that you had never stated that I didn't need to see the teacher. Retorted, seeing you struggle to remain present and attempt in spite of everything gave me purpose once more. It revived me. Keanu gulped hard, and I believed I was just. You are attempting to survive, but in doing so, you also assisted another person in surviving. The host inquired softly as they sat side by side on stage. "Mr. Whitmore, why did you have such a strong faith in Keanu?" The instructor looked at Keanu. He stopped then because I noticed something in you that I don't often see, empathy. Not the sort you preach about, but the kind you live. Added, I saw that even though you didn't talk much in class, you stayed behind to assist others. You paid attention when no one else did, and you saw things that other children would have missed. You weren't acting, that was who you were. Overcome, I always felt invisible. Keanu gazed at the floor. Mr. Whitmore grinned and Yukai stared at me as if I were important. You did, and you still. Keanu then questioned, "Why did you give me?" The moment was sensitive, deep, and unshakable. The teacher giggled quietly because I wasn't looking for the lead role in that play. I was searching for truth, and even in those days, you conveyed more truth in quiet than most people do. Words. The audience was quiet. Many were crying. Keanu's voice cracked. I've always wanted to thank you, but I'm not sure how Mr. Whitmore managed to. Keanu said, "This moment is enough," and then he asked, "Why?" Mr. Whitmore softly exhaled, "Now I come here after all this time. Because I have one final gift for you that I've held on to for years." Keanu stared at him in confusion. "What is it?" The instructor produced an old, worn envelope wrapped with string from his coat pocket and gave it to. "This has always been yours, Keanu. I was simply waiting for the appropriate opportunity." When it was time to give it back, Keanu gently gripped the envelope in his shaking hands. Everyone in the audience, including Keanu, knew that whatever was within would be revealed. Didn't yet understand who he was and how the reunion would alter everything. The room was still shining. Keanu was still processing the barrage of memories as he stood next to Mr. Whitmore. The host softly broke the "Mr. Whitmore, when did you realize that Keanu was different?" The old teacher's eyes lit up with a smile. He looked to Keanu for a brief, silent, but memorable moment. "Do you?" Keanu, a boy with cerebral palsy in your class, nodded slowly. "Most children disregarded him because he couldn't talk," Mr. Whitmore added. "One day during a group project, I observed you sitting next to him. You helped him pick out the book and murmured the sentences, and when the others chuckled, but you didn't stop Keanu, who appeared surprised. I observed that. I knew you weren't simply nice that day, you were also light. The studio was You didn't do it for recognition, and you didn't even believe anyone saw, but that's what makes it genuine. Keanu bent his head in profound emotion, demonstrating the purest sort that no one can see. I didn't think I mattered back then, mister. I always felt like I was simply getting by. I trusted in you because of your heart, not your skill, Whitmore said, placing a hand on his shoulder. You believed that your silence was a sign of weakness, but it was actually your strength. People listened to you because you felt sincerely and didn't spoke loudly. To you now, Keanu paused to absorb the meaning of those words. I always questioned whether I had any genuine value at the time. You gave me the impression that The instructor grinned and said, you didn't need to change who you were. Mr. Whitmore dug into his jacket and said, there's something else I've kept, just as Keanu believed the moment was over. I waited until you were ready, but I always intended to give it to you. He handed over a tiny package that has been meticulously wrapped in brown paper and secured with an old string. What is Mr. Whitmore's voice? Keanu glanced down at its hands, which were quivering a little. I want you to open it first because it's the final piece of your past and possibly the most authentic aspect of who you are. Keanu nodded, his heart racing, but it was too late. Knew whatever was inside him when he held the package in his hands would alter his perception of things. Keanu carefully gripped the brown-wrapped package. H had softened the paper and faded the string, making it seem as though it had been waiting years. Keanu untied the rope inside a cupboard after Mr. Whitmore nodded softly. Keanu recognized the single folded sheet of lined paper right away, saying, this is my. He unfurled it, his voice quivering as he murmured, the first time I really tried. When I grow up, I want to be someone who makes pain smaller, he said, reading the title out loud. Reading, I hope to be someone who can relate to others even when they are unable to express their pain, but I don't think I'll be able to. I want to be famous, but I also want to be compassionate and the type of person that creates space. Keanu felt safer. He looked up in shock. You kept this, Mr. Whitmore. His eyes were wet. Because I understood that it was more than simply a task, it was who you already were. Reading this made the studio gasp. Mr. Whitmore went on to say, I saw someone who wanted to be good instead of great. That's uncommon and... Keanu put a palm over his heart, saying, I thought acting was more powerful. Pretending, but in reality, ever since Mr. Whitmore nodded, I've been attempting to live up to this page. You've already... Keanu turned to the audience and said, fame didn't influence me. This man... He turned back to Mr. after saying one silent belief at the appropriate moment. Whitmore, the world now sees you because you saw me when I was invisible. The host came forward, clearly moved. Why did you keep it for so long? Mr. Whitmore spoke softly because I knew he would eventually have to recall who. The crowd stood, honoring him without applauding, and then Keanu lifted the microphone one final time if you had the opportunity to express gratitude to the person who saved. He glanced around the room and occasionally said, will you do it in silence? Timely speech is more valuable than a lifetime of achievement.